program. And on behalf of Howard Wolpe, our director, and our co-sponsor, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I would like to welcome you all to the Wilson Center. Excuse me. I was running up and down the stairs trying to call this guy in Kenya. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it's the nation's living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, aiming to bridge the gap between scholars and policymakers. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a forum for open dialogue. Now, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today's event, Ambassador Johnny Carson.
Okay.
Well, I get to say some things about you.
That's all right.
Can't let you get off that easy. In September 2006, Ambassador Carson joined the National Intelligence Council as a National Intelligence Officer for Africa after a 37-year career in foreign service. Prior to this appointment, he served as the Senior Vice President of the National Defense University in Washington from 2003 to 2006. Ambassador Carson's foreign service career includes ambassadorships to Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda. He also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs. Earlier in his career, Ambassador Carson served as desk officer in the Africa section at State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, staff officer for the Secretary of State, and staff director for the Africa Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives. And now let me turn it over to you, Ambassador Carson. Thanks.
Natalie, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. We have an extraordinarily full house and an extraordinarily full program this morning. We have with us to talk about Kenya four individuals who have great experience and expertise on that country and the region. We are extremely pleased that we have been able to establish a television link-up with Kenya so that one of our speakers will be able to participate on the ground in Nairobi. Howard Wolpe asked me to chair this session for him. He is out of town, and I am pleased to do so, having served in Kenya for 4 years and having spent an enormous amount of time working in and around that country. Before I formally introduce our speakers, I would like to set the stage very, very briefly and say just a few words about Kenya. Kenya clearly is the most important country in East Africa and the Greater Horn of Africa, and certainly until the recent violence that followed the December 27th elections, it was regarded clearly as the most stable, the most peaceful, and most democratic state in the region. Since that country's independence in 1963, Kenya has established itself again very rightfully as the financial, commercial, economic, and transportation hub of East Africa and extending all the way into the Great Lakes region. Its economy, which has been growing robustly, clearly over the last 5 or 6 years, is the 5th largest in Africa and is the largest non-oil, non-mineral based economy on the continent. Regionally and domestically, its economy is an engine, a dynamic engine for internal growth, a dynamic engine for regional growth. Kenya has also been an extraordinarily good and close partner to the United States in many, many areas, having hosted for 4 years the successful talks that concluded the agreement between the SPLM and Khartoum, creating the Comprehensive Peace Agreement back in 2005, and also hosting on a number of occasions, talks on Somalia and other regional problems. The aftermath of the Kenyan elections have shattered Kenya's international image, have led to death and destruction on a widespread basis, undermined and disrupted, as I said, one of Africa's most important economies. And it has raised an enormous number of questions about what caused this and why, and where Kenya is going, whether this problem will be solved quickly, or whether we are in fact looking at a cycle of downward political instability and turmoil in a state who's been characterized largely by peace, stability, and economic growth. We have with us this morning, I think, four of the finest individuals we could find and put together to talk in great detail about the elections itself, what happened after the elections, and what, in fact, people think will be the future of Kenya and the region. Our first speaker this morning will be Professor Joe Barkan, formerly of the University of Iowa, now an independent consultant, but known to many of you as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center at one time, the U.S. Institute for Peace, and associated now with CSIS. Joel was an election observer at the past elections for the International Republican Institute. Joel will speak a little bit about the election and the election process. Our second speaker this morning, I'm very pleased to announce, is Mwai Kaia. Mwai, I hope you can hear me, and I certainly can. In fact, we can see you on our television screen here in the Woodrow Wilson Center. Maina Kaia, I'm sorry.
I hear you very clearly.
Okay. Maina Kaia is one of the most important civil society and human rights personalities and activists in Kenya. Current chairman of the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights, a co-founder and executive director of the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, a lawyer trained at the University of Nairobi and also at Harvard Law School, and is one of the most outstanding activists, lawyers, and practitioners in the field in Nairobi. And Maina, we're extremely pleased to have you. Our third speaker this morning will be Stephen Ndegwa. Stephen is speaking in his capacity, and I underscore in his capacity, as a visiting scholar from UCLA. Many people know Stephen in his Washington capacity as one of the most prominent experts on democracy and governance issues at the World Bank, but he is not, and I underscore not, speaking on behalf of the bank, but on behalf of himself and his capacity as a scholar. Stephen is a Kenyan, but he's also a prolific writer on issues related to Kenya and democracy. And our final speaker this morning will be Callistus Juma from Harvard University, noted scientist, environmentalist, but will be speaking about his country with some degree of knowledge and understanding that only comes from years of having worked and studied and lived in Kenya. And we're extremely happy to have Callistus Juma down from Cambridge to be with us this morning. I might add he is also an extraordinarily prolific writer as well, and has written widely both in the sciences and in the social sciences. Don't be deceived by the scientific nature of his background. I'm going to say only that we're going to limit our speakers to approximately 10 minutes. I'm going to try to be a rather draconian timekeeper. And then after that, we will open the session up to questions. I know there are many people in the audience who have enormous expertise on Kenya. I see several former Kenyan ambassadors, DCMs, people who know the country extraordinarily well, Ambassador Mark Bellamy, Ambassador Hodak, Ambassador Princeton Lyman, among others in the audience this morning. So there are people here who have enormous expertise. I see a number of folks who've worked for aid in the World Bank who are here as well as a number of diplomats. We're extraordinarily pleased to have you. It's an important session, and we have a serious and high-quality panel to talk. I'm going to let Professor Barkan open this up. Joel?
Thank you very much, Johnny. It's an honor to be here, and particularly given the audience, as Ambassador Carson just noted, it's a bit humbling. I've been asked to lead out with a description of what I saw as an observer, and perhaps bracket it with a few analytic comments on the side. Let me start by saying that while I was an observer for the 11-person delegation mounted by the International Republican Institute, that, like Stephen, I am also speaking in my own capacity and not on behalf of IRI. They issued their own statement. I signed off on that as of the first day of the election, but what you're hearing is basically my current take on the matter. One of the nice things about this session this morning, given that so many of you are knowledgeable about Kenya, we can pretty much not spend time on the basics, except to say, by way of introduction, that this, of course, was the fourth multi-party election in Kenya since the reintroduction of multi-party politics in 1992. And each one of those elections, and even leading up to this one, had become progressively better. That is to say, in 1992 and 1997, you had a very unlevel playing field. The opposition was harassed by the then regime of former President Moi. The count, however, was pretty accurate. This time around, you had just the reverse. You had a level playing field before the election. You even had a count at the polling stations, at least as far as I observed and the other observers saw, that went not only reasonably well, but in many respects movingly well. That is to say, I'll describe it in a minute, and then things go wrong at the last stage, and the election unravels, and you have the classic problem with any democratic election, or the classic challenge is a better way to put it. Will the losers accept the results? Will they regard the entire electoral process as legitimate, accept the results, and come back to contest for political power on another day? And when those results are called into question, you have the situation that you have now. Now, a few words about the run-up to the election. First of all, as I already suggested, in the 3 or 4 months in the run-up to the election, the actual campaigns that were mounted by the rival candidates were arguably the freest and fairest that had occurred in Kenya, perhaps at any time, but certainly since the reintroduction of multi-party elections in 1992. Candidates were allowed to go where they wanted. The provincial administration did not hassle them permits for candidates, including at the parliamentary level, were not withdrawn. Things went well. Also, media access was pretty good. That's in part because of the great strides Kenya has made in the 1990s and early 2000s in terms of the opening up of the media. You no longer had to deal with strictly the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, which tilted towards the incumbent, but that's not surprising. There were private TV stations, 3 private television networks, 42 FM radio stations, I believe, lots of talk radio, lots of press, civil society, which already been mentioned, and which Maina is a leading example of. This is the new Kenya, and it gave everybody a great cause for optimism. But to some extent, it may also have lulled people to sleep. And the reason is that this was also a closely contested election from the start. Yet another example of Kenya's, shall we say, maturation is that Kenya, this was in some respects a very American-style campaign that the candidates ran, a lot of money sloshing around, not necessarily for the good, but survey research and polling prior to the elections, you had a series of polls from July onward which showed, first of all, that Raila Odinga was in the lead, but at the end, basically, it was going to be a dead heat. That is to say, this was an election that was too close to call. Although Raila was still predicted to be the winner by all the polls, it was within the margin of sampling error, and the quality, that is the methodological quality and sophistication of these polls, compares to anything that we have here in the United States. So we knew that the election was too close to call, and therefore that put a real premium on the events unfolding in the day before the election, election day, and in the count immediately after, that they would be scrupulously followed according to procedure, so that the integrity of the process and, above all, the legitimacy, therefore, of the process would be maintained. Let me now cut briefly to what I saw, because I've already used much of my time. I was a short-term observer. IRI only went out on the 22nd, but we saw more or less the same things that the much larger EU delegation saw. They had 30 long-term observers arriving in early November, and then 90 observers arriving just before the poll. In the day before the election, and I was posted to Nakuru district and the constituencies of Nakuru town, Molo, which is one of these areas immediately to the west, up the western side of the Rift Valley escarpment, where you've had some of these ethnic clashes going on, and then in the adjacent constituency of Rungai, where parenthetically one of Daniel Arap Moi's sons was running, and a side aspect of this election is all 3 of his sons ran, and all 3 got beat badly, as did Nicholas Biwott. I think it's really the final obituary to the Moi regime. But in the day before the election, we went around and talked to the returning officers, and what we saw, what we gleaned from them is that basically everything was in place. That is to say, the presiding officers had been trained and trained well. The materials, such as the indelible ink and the procedural forms and all this stuff, was out already at the polling stations. It was only the ballots and the sealed ballot boxes that needed to be shipped out. I saw that process beginning in Molo, and it looked totally chaotic. There were about 100 matatus all around and people milling around, and people were a little bit late in getting their ballots. But as we learned the next day, although some did not return to their polling stations until 2 a.m. in the morning, everything started on time. That was also true in Nakuru town. Polls opened about 6:15, 15 minutes late. In other words, in contrast to 2002 and 97, the polls opened more or less on time. Everything was in place. Very long lines, very moving to see over 500 or 600 people in line waiting their turn. That created some sort of jostling at first, which I can get into a little bit later, and allegations of malfeasance. But by and large, the lines cleaned out. And by the end of the day, when I was out in Ragai and earlier in the afternoon up in Molo, it was clear that everyone who wished to vote was going to be able to vote by the time the polls closed. The polls closed at 5 p.m. They started the count. I wish I could have filmed this because it's almost like a civic education primer. Each ballot was unfolded and placed in a stack. They counted the stack. They then went through and divided them one by one, the presiding officer holding up the ballot so all the party agents could see, putting it down. The count was clearly transparent and fair. It was posted on the polling station. The results there then had to be sent back to the constituency headquarters and from then on to Nairobi, and that's where basically things went awry. You then had a period of 48 hours, that is, from the night of the 27th into the evening of the 29th, where throughout the 28th and into the first half, indeed up to about 2 p.m. of Saturday the 28th, Raila Odinga is ahead by roughly 370,000 votes in the presidential race. You then have things are frozen. Then is a very rowdy press conference in Nairobi at the headquarters of the Electoral Commission of Kenya, and the head of the commission, Samuel Kivito, gets up and says, "We are going to take as much time as it takes to get an accurate count." He then gives a preliminary count as he goes out the door, and suddenly Raila Odinga is ahead by only 38,000 votes. On the Kenya television, moreover, you also have contradictory reports. First, 159 constituencies, or 75% of the constituencies reporting, then 189, then only 159 again, then nothing after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to conclude that something is profoundly wrong here. By my own calculations, President Kibaki at that point would have needed to obtain somewhere between 62 and 65% of the outstanding vote in order to overcome Raila's lead, but he was receiving only about 49% at that point, or about 48%. In addition to that, an exit poll of over 5,500 interviews conducted by IRI, which unfortunately has not been released, but has been reported in Slate magazine, so I take it to be accurate, indicated that Raila was ahead 49-41. The European Union called for an international audit, not a recount, but really an audit of the forms that came from the polling stations to the election headquarters. Unfortunately, Raila Odinga and the ODM did not immediately jump on that request. I think they should have. Perhaps things would have turned out a little bit differently, maybe not. As for the United States, we initially congratulated the performance of the Electoral Commission in what, in retrospect, was clearly a premature statement, and now we know what has followed in the wake of the election. I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Joel, thank you very much for getting us off to an excellent start. Before I turn to Maina Kiai in Nairobi, I'd like to make one more introduction, and we do in fact have this morning with us the Kenyan ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Ambassador Ogego, and we are pleased to have him with us this morning. Ambassador, sorry to not see you come in, but we're pleased to have you. Maina, are you still there? Can you be?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we can actually all see you except the four of us who are on the dais, but you have a packed audience observing you. Could you take a little bit of your time to bring us up to speed on where things are right now in Kenya and how you view the situation politically and in humanitarian terms over the last week to 10 days.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me start by saying that, what I heard what Joel said, and a lot of the things I endorse. A lot of us were anxious and were worried by some of the trends we're seeing coming into the elections, and we tried as much as we could to see how we could help the situation, how we could move it. I personally was not surprised by the way it went. I think that there was a lot of things happening at the Electoral Commission that raised eyebrows and tried to see how we could help it. So I think that with the benefit of hindsight, one sees a number of things that should have been dealt with, and that if you put together, it may paint a picture that suggests an orchestrated and well-planned approach to make sure the election result went one way. That said, I think at this point, one cannot say who won or who lost, and I think that many of us have been asking for an independent investigative forensic audit to see what can be done. The situation on the ground in Kenya, I don't think has ever been as scary and as worrying as it is today. I think we have got about 250,000 plus internally displaced people, about as much as we had in Kenya in the 90s between 92 and 98, through the state-sponsored clashes that were then led by Daniel Moi. So we've got in less than a week about the same number of IDPs in the country. The number of deaths we're seeing has been about 500, 600. Again, there's no accurate count. We haven't yet been able to get that accurately, and that's huge over a week. We have seen basically three types of violence, in a sense. The first kind of violence that's leading to death, the first kind has been the spontaneous, disorganized response violence once the election results, first of all once they were delayed and then once they were announced. And that was that spontaneous violence that I think you saw in many urban areas. The second form of violence we have seen is the one that seems less than spontaneous, looks a little organized, a little bit well organized, and we've seen a lot of that again in the Rift Valley and also in parts of Nairobi through militia groups, as far as we see, which look pretty organized and pretty dangerous as well. The third form of violence we have seen is the state violence, where we have got reports of quite a few people shot to death. I have got pictures in my office of about 50 people shot to death in Kakamega in the head that look like extrajudicial executions or extraordinary use of force by the police in dealing with this issue since it happened. One of the most fundamental things that this quagmire of the elections has done is that it's hampered and hurt the Kenyans' belief in the right to vote. I think one of the major benefits of 2002 elections and the referendum in 2005 was that Kenyans finally believed in the right to vote, and in the vote as a way of expressing our views, good or bad, whichever way it was, and using the vote to determine changes as they went ahead. I think when you speak to many people, there's now dissatisfaction with it. And kind of worrying, what can you do if you want to change if you're not sure about the results that are announced during elections. I think there's a huge need at this point to have the two protagonists sit down and dialogue. And I don't think at this point grandstanding is helping anybody. In fact, we see a trend when we look at some of the comments made around. When there seems to be hope in negotiations, you see a calming down of the situation. When there's hardline or some actions that seem to suggest hardline, then you see a spike in the violence. So we are seeing this and noticing it, and clearly we are in a political quagmire. I know many people keep saying that we should go to the courts, but I think the damage that has been done to our institutions and our confidence in institutions by the conduct of the election results announcing has been tremendous. And I think it's incumbent upon the political players to accept that not only is this thing about elections, but it's also about confidence in the institutions of state, institutions around the media, and other places. in this country, there seems to be no third way. The moment you say something, then you're tagged. And I'm sure that even after this conversation, I will be tagged as I have been tagged. It's part of the processes that go on in this country, and it's a shame because we have been very clear as the independent sector, not politically aligned. We've been very clear that it's important to deal with both the violence that's happened and the cause of that violence. Some will tell you that some of this violence seems to have been pre-planned. We have looked for that evidence, we haven't seen it. It may have been. And one of the things that's also very disturbing is the beginning of the use of the word genocide by both sides in this thing. Now we've got to be careful when we talk about when we start such alarmist language in a context like this. And I think all of us here know that the conflicts and the deaths in Congo have not been termed genocide. The deaths of the Ijaw in the Niger Delta have not been termed genocide. The deaths in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Cote d'Ivoire have never been termed genocide. And one of the things, and I had this discussion with people who are representing the government side, people from the Kibaki Tena group, is that when genocide has been used and has been allocated as a term to use, there's either been state complicity or state omission. Either the state is itself involved in the genocide or the state is unable to quell the violence. Then that creates this whole term of genocide. So I think it's counterproductive for anybody at this point to start talking about genocide. There have been killings on every side. The other misconception which we have to clarify is that this is not an ethnic conflict. This is a political conflict with ethnic overtones. The cleavages in this country have been there for a while. The cleavages have been big. I think the immediate trigger to the violence is clearly the lack of transparency within the election process. When the chairman of the Electoral Commission stands up and says to all of us on television, I don't know who won the election, surely that tells us there's something wrong. And surely that tells us that we need to find a peaceful, non-violent resolution to this whole crisis. And it's not about grandstanding, it's not about having certificates and saying this certificate is there. In fact, when we look at the analysis of law, we find that different parts of the election law were flouted by the ECK in making that announcement. Now, any lawyer will tell you that when there's been a breach of law, a violation of law, then everything that stems from that violation is void because of that earlier validity. You cannot validate an invalid act. So we are basically saying that that whole process then is invalid and that the election announcement was invalid. And therefore now we need to go back and find a way to get some sanity and some clarity. Clearly though, as we look forward, one of the big things that comes out in this whole issue for us is that there are serious issues that we have to deal with regarding presidential power. The major point of contention has to be presidential power. Because we have an absolute monarch in this country and our constitution and our laws. That's got to be addressed because part of this whole quagmire is the fear of the person exercising state power, the person holding state power, the person who is making decisions for all of us using presidential power. There's got to be a solution to that so that everybody feels included, so that the fear is reduced dramatically. But we can't go beyond this process until we have peace, truth, and justice. We've got to be cautioning everybody that calm does not mean peace, that the absence of conflict does not mean peace. And if we don't deal with these issues as they are now, then the likelihood of these things emerging again, as they did after the 90s, is very high. And this is the argument we've been putting forward. Unfortunately, we know people are so strewn on both sides, hardliners on both sides, and it's a great pity. We've been calling upon both sides to show statesmanship, both sides to understand that this is no more than about the two of them or their two sides. This is about Kenya. And if you care about Kenya, then you need to sit down. Then you need to start the process of compromising. You need to start the process of dialogue. We cannot stand and ask, you must do this, you must not do that, you must not do this. It is that process that will bring us together and begin giving us the hope. I understand that today there seems to have been an acceptance that Kofi Annan can now come in and be the full-time negotiator, facilitator, whatever they're being called. Again, terminology in this country is major. Some people want to call him facilitator, others want to call him a tourist. Whichever way it is, that Kofi Annan has, I think both sides have accepted that Kofi Annan can be the facilitator, bringing this on a more longer-term basis because, of course, President Kufuor has a country to run and I think was leaving or has gone back to Ghana this afternoon. This is now about 6:45 Kenyan time, so it's this evening. I heard he was about to go. But it's been a very trying time. It's been a very difficult time. I am not sure. I think the healing from this will take a very, very long time. We have been looking for statesmen and leaders and voices of reason. I think the media has begun getting it right after this. After imploring us to be calm for a long time, I think they're beginning to understand that there's a need to have truth and justice so that we can have real peace on this issue. And let me just stop there, but at some point I'd like to go through some of the steps that many of us, including myself, sat down with the Electoral Commission of Kenya well before this elections, trying to help them make the process of the results tallying and announcement of results far more transparent, and which often were rebuffed at some point and over the process for some reason that I think anybody's guess is as good as mine why the ECK, the Electoral Commission, declined these offers to make it much more efficient and transparent. Thank you.
Mina, thank you very, very much for an excellent presentation. You have a very, very attentive audience on this side, and I hope that you can stay on the line so that you can participate actively in the question and answer session after the conclusion of our next two speakers. Our third speaker this morning is Stephen Ndegwa, and Stephen is going to talk a little bit about the current politics and the way ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador Carson. Again, I should say, even though Ambassador Carson spent about 2 minutes explaining this, that I'm speaking in my own personal capacity and not as a World Bank official. Let me start by saying that, as Joel has pointed out, and I think as Maina also clearly laid out, the facts of the election are very much in dispute. But I think the claims that are made around the election results and the consequences of that, especially the violence and the fact that the government that is in power right now has already declared itself as the government, a sitting government, are not in question. So in a sense, we are in some ways getting beyond the election itself. And my comments will not speak about on the election, because I think in some ways things have already been determined. One could argue that these could always unravel, but I think we're at a point where one has to seek a solution that is about how the next couple of years, how the governance environment in the next couple of years will be like, rather than revisiting whether the election can be unraveled or not. Part of the reason is, if you look at the experience of the experience of the last 15 years in Africa, there's been no election, however disputed, however violently opposed, that has been reversed. Okay? Simply none. There've been no elected presidents who have been forced to resign. We've had problematic elections, sometimes similarly problematic in Nigeria twice, in Uganda, in other places, and it has not been reversed. So just to be realistic, it is perhaps difficult to assume that, in fact, the momentum will be such that you can remove a government that sees itself as a re-elected government, unless you're willing to contemplate a greater deal of violence than we have seen so far. So it might be, and I think there are a couple of ways you can actually address the issues that this election raises, which, while I agree with Joel and Maina that it raises quite a number of electoral issues, I think fundamentally in the longer term history of Kenya, it raises very fundamental issues about the nature of the state in Kenya. the nature of a very divided society, where we've had several attempts to try to reconfigure that society in a way that allows a shared prosperity for all groups, addressing regional imbalances, and unraveling this ethnic leitmotif of conducting politics. And all those attempts, including some that have been driven by a class consciousness, have been destroyed, often violently. And I think we should not forget that. We should not forget that Kenya has had some incredible moments of violence, including assassinations. Whenever people and groups have raised opposition to the fundamental nature of the state. And I would argue that this election, even though the particular participants did not speak to the restructuring of the state, actually puts on the table the necessity of that debate. And I will speak a little bit about why I think that's the case. In a sense, I would argue that the 2007 post-election crisis reflects really the ultimate maturing of the crisis that the 2002 election of the NAC administration actually portended. A few of us argued in 2002 amid the euphoria, and I think John Haberson and Joel will remember some of these items that we've talked about before, that there was really no reason to be so euphoric about 2002. It was great that KANU had gone. It was great that Moi was gone. But in fact, the structure of the politics and the fundamental driving forces of politicking was no different. There were at least four fundamental concerns that we had at the time, and I think these remain, and I think they're actually much more much more highlighted at this point. One is this notion that you can have a democratic transition without really transforming the nature of state power. And that's what you had in Kenya. That's what you've had in several number of countries in Africa, where the ethic of the state remains a heavily centralized one. The imperial presidency that Maina talks about, it is the same imperial presidency every presidential candidate in Kenya wants. Okay? Nobody seems to want to unravel that, and it is extremely important that that gets unraveled. It will not get unraveled in the way that the politics is conducted right now between these two major political vehicles, if you want, or political parties, if you want to be brave about naming them that. The nature of ethnic politics, the fact that we have to think of electoral blocks essentially as ethnic blocks, not even as class or regional blocks, but fundamentally shopping around for ethnic barons who can marshal ethnic votes in one way or the other. And one of the failures, one of the reasons for the failure of the PNU is that they were not able to marshal enough and as broad-based an ethnic set of barons as ODM was able to. And thirdly, the patrimonial politics. This again was not going to change. This is something that that drove the Moi regime. It is something that was promised to be unraveled, but in fact has driven the Kibaki regime. And it is also something one could see the early signs of that within the ODM hierarchy. And I was not convinced that they would actually be able to reverse that trend. The second set of challenges that 2002 did not work on or sort of reverse was improving parliamentary performance. Parliament has grown in importance, has grown as an important core policy maker in Kenya, but it has not been able to have the kind of balance that would detract from the immense power of the presidency. So the presidency really remains the prize for everybody, and Parliament is still at the mercy of what the president wants. The story of corruption is well known, so I won't dwell on that much. And fourth was this idea that you could not sustain the NAC coalition. And I would argue even if ODM had come to power, it would have been very difficult to sustain that coalition, because these are coalitions that are made essentially to win elections but not truly to govern and share power in the way that the principals expect when they were going into the coalition arrangements. So I would argue in this case, this failure in 2007 again, reflects an ongoing failure of how the politics in the democratic dispensation have been structured. And that the benefit of this moment, tragic as it is, criminally tragic in certain ways, is actually a moment to try to figure out whether one could realign the politics of Kenya. Is this likely to happen? My answer right now is that unfortunately it is not likely to happen. I can come back as to why and where I think the impetus of this could come from. There are three reasons, and these are fairly straightforward, I think. One is that with the selection of Kalonzo Musyoka as vice president and the joining of ODM Kenya into the PNU government, you've lost possibly the real natural mediating partner between the two major blocs. You've lost at least a partner that would ensure that the dialogue is not simply one that is conceived as a Kikuyu-Luo dialogue, but in fact one that becomes a bit more representative of sharing power across different regions, not just between the two major groups. And one could look at the history of the political history of Kenya, and especially at intense moments where the debate around the state is aroused as one that pits these two groups together against each other. So we've lost that opportunity, and I think it's really tragic that ODM Kenya has gone into this coalition, I think, at least from what I've read in the documents I've seen, without getting any concessions that speak to these fundamental problems, but rather simply concessions about what kind of divisions of the spoils of office one gets. Second, ODM itself, I think, has not really articulated a vision about altering the politics, but it's been more a vision of complaints about not being able to secure power. And while we could have long arguments about whether they're right or wrong, I think at some point that's besides the point. And one has to think about how can they use this opportunity to really advance the real core issues that Kenya faces about restructuring state power, reducing the imperial presidency, opening up parliament in a way that actually allows for better representation across the board and better sharing of resources in Kenya. The third reason is that the PNU, partly because of the nature of the coalition that makes it up, but also because they are incumbent, the incumbent regime, they're truly not interested in changing the nature of the state. They're quite comfortable with this. You wouldn't expect them to change that. And in fact, it serves their core constituencies, whether you think of these constituencies as the business community or the central province groups. In terms of the way forward, and we can come back to talk about some of these issues later on, and I have some other comments that I'll be happy to share during Q&A on the ethnic, whether this is an ethnic conflict or not, and I very much agree with Maina's comments on this. But in terms of the way forward, I see three options, and I actually believe that it is ODM more than any other party that has the standing at this point and the opportunity to set the direction of the way forward, and also perhaps to even be able to influence what outcomes are achieved. I see three options, and one of which I favor. One is to have a settlement of the electoral dispute through a broad-based coalition government. We know the train has left the station in some ways. I know there's been comments from, especially when Kufuor came to town, that the government was was open to unraveling the cabinet basically to accommodate this. But that would be one solution, and I don't think it's a very favorable solution because it does not allow the raising of the issues that drove the numbers that we see on either side, that drove the closeness of this election. And I think that also gave heat to the kind of ethnic animus that you saw after the election. So in fact, it might be better for ODM to stay out of power, which I know Raila has at some point expressed, rather than to join this government, because I think the same problems that came up in 2002 will visit such a coalition, and it would break apart fairly soon. The second one is this reflects some of what I argue elsewhere, that Kenya has actually evolved a history of pact making that allows them to resolve certain very difficult issues at moments of crisis. And there's always been a moment of crisis. Nobody seems to think clearly beyond that. And the classic one is the IPPG reforms of 1997, which are the ones that have made possible some of the things that Joel is talking about, to the point of allowing for numbers, the vote count to be declared at the constituency level, which is something that has actually saved the 2002 election, because Moi could not manipulate the numbers centrally, because they all came out already in a decentralized way. And I would argue that there's already a built-in momentum within the political class to allow this. They're in great favor of having sort of controlled environments of discussion. You have a tendency towards commissions, towards retreats, and so on. And I think this is where you could push this kind of sets of agreements. And it has to be a set of pacts that has more to do with restructuring the state than just the electoral pact. It has to speak to some of the regional inequalities, to some of the severe poverty problems in Nyanza province and northeastern province, and in really scaling down the power of the presidency, including, for example, ensuring, for instance, parliamentary confirmation of executive appointments, which I think would actually serve this coming administration, this next 5 years, South Kenyans better than if we allowed just unilateral appointments. Finally, would be going back to the constitutional reform process, which would be a thoroughgoing discussion of the nature of the state and changing that. I don't think this actually is meaningful at this point. We just came out of a constitutional discussion in the last 2 years. It suspended every other thing. And will likely reproduce the election division and likely reproduce the last constitutional debate division. Although I do think in the long term it's the best option, it's just not the right option at this moment. I would actually favor the pact making as a more reasonable way of getting there than any of the other two. Let me stop here and be happy to answer questions and comment further during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you very, very much for some very good analysis. The other thing I want to do is to thank all of our speakers for keeping pretty much to their time, and that's great. Our final presenter before we get to the questions this morning is Callistus Juma, professor at Harvard University and the director of the Science, Technology, and Globalization project at Harvard University, and also a Kenyan citizen. Sir.
Thank you. This is one of those sessions where you don't have to prepare in advance because you really don't know what to say. The situation is evolving very fast, and Mr. Chairman, actually, when you declared yourself the moderator, the place that really needs moderation is Kenya, not here. so we could use your services at this time. I wanted to build on Stephen's points about that we really have a new country, a new Kenya that is not being properly served by the old constitutional order. To put it bluntly, I think we've come to the end of the first republic of Kenya. And what we've been going through in the last 5 years, or even a little more than that, is an attempt to reinvent the country, essentially. The constitutional discussions were an attempt to reinvent the country, and that didn't work very well. The current situation with the president taking over power is another attempt to find ways of reinventing the country. And so there are these experiments going on at the moment, figuring out how to bring Kenya in line with contemporary realities. We have a constitution, basically, which is a continuation of the colonial order, organized largely around land. We now live in a modern economy, which is radically different. And so the question is, how do you transform, as Stephen said, the Kenyan state, which is really the most fundamental question, so that the structure of politics is aligned with contemporary economic concerns. This is really the biggest challenge. And I had a unique opportunity until about a year and a half ago of serving on the President's Economic Advisory Council, and this is really the issue we were dealing with on a day-to-day basis, except that we are advising on economic matters which had very clear constitutional implications, and then you had separately a constitutional review process that wasn't taking into account economic questions, and so there's this disjunction. If you just take a simple fact that almost 60% of the GDP of Kenya is accounted by the city of Nairobi. This is a serious issue in the regional equity that you have to address, not just through economic policy, but through constitutional concerns. And you see it a bit reflected in discussions about decentralization. It's really, I think, there are fundamental questions to be addressed here. So the way I think about this is I think of, in situations of this kind, I think of role models, like what would be Kenya's role model if we were to think about ways by which Kenya could get out of its current crisis. Where would we search for lessons? And I think there are many examples. Kenya is not the first country that has gone into a crisis of this kind. I think of, say, Malaysia in 1969, the riots, the ethnic riots in Malaysia in March 1969 have a lot of parallels with what's going on in Kenya at the moment. And the way the country responded to that was to create a new economic program whose main focus was to promote social cohesion. And so what we've seen as the rapid transformation of the Malaysian economy wasn't an attempt by Malaysia to catch up with the other Asian countries, was an attempt to create a political system that focused on inclusion, which was the basis for prior riots. And there are very clear, very simple elements that go into this, which include massive investment in the expansion of infrastructure services. This was done in Malaysia, it's been done in Brazil, it's been done in various countries of the former Yugoslavia, for example, to basically create, if you like, the economy of hope, so that people can start to look ahead and see that they have opportunities to participate in the economy. So I think the first step, it doesn't matter which government is in office at the moment, they have to address the question of expanding economic opportunities. And the first area I see is massive investment in infrastructure. If you like, think of the equivalent of the New Deal for Kenya at the moment. That's what's needed. And to have two consequences. One, it will effectively create opportunities to move goods, services, and ideas, which are limited at the moment. Secondly, it will start to address the question of youth unemployment, which I consider to be a major factor in the country at the moment, in that you can start to actually get people engaged in employment. And related to that is the restructuring of the educational system, so that the curriculum of the country signals that the people going into the educational system have the opportunity to participate in the new economy. I talk to a lot of young Kenyans who say, I'm studying stuff in sociology, economics, politics that I don't think is going to help me when the global economy needs people who understand computing, engineering, and other fields. And these are signaling mechanisms that give people hope, especially the younger generations. In terms of political constituencies, I think we really should be thinking about new alliances in the country, not the ethnic alliances that, as Maina put it rightly, we have. These are economic questions that have ethnic overtones. I think that we should be thinking about building new alliances around the business community, for example, because these are constituencies that cut across ethnic lines. Very strong voices, they influence what's going on in the country. And secondly, the youth is a very, very important factor. I've pointed out recently that the country actually needs to think about lowering the voting age. If you have a situation where something like 5 million Kenyans are between the age of 12 and 18, they are making a lot of decisions. Many of them are family decisions. You will find even households headed by 12-year-olds. An uncle may drop in to say hello once a week, but they are making decisions, important decisions. And you have that section of the population is disenfranchised, essentially. It's also the most active, the most creative, and the most connected through electronic networking. Those are areas, I think, which constitute this larger package of reinventing the state that we really ought to be thinking about. So I'm mostly interested in what happens beyond the immediate crisis around the elections. And it doesn't matter which government is in office. Somebody has to take responsibility in thinking carefully about how to align the constitutional structures with the economic realities of the country. And my final point on this is that none of this is going to be done only in the context of Kenya as a country. It will have to be part of a regional integration effort. We've seen very quickly how the crisis has affected Uganda, Rwanda, and others. The first phone calls I was getting from ministers in the region were actually from Uganda and Rwanda, not from Kenya. I was hoping to spend the first week of this year with President Kagame, and we decided that it wouldn't be wise until the elections were over. So there are regional issues that need to be taken into account. That, in fact, the elements, rudimentary elements of that regional integration program are already in place in the context of the East African community, and we should think about working with them. I don't know if this addresses the immediate legal questions. I think this is now, we're in the domain of realpolitik, and I think we're going to see a lot of this posturing going on. I was never persuaded that mediation would work. When colleagues from the UK government called me up looking for names for mediation, I said, look, you can't develop a mediated scenario without the parties willing to accept a mediated outcome. So mediation is probably not the best option at the moment. I think what is important is to open all possible doors for that people can continue to talk to each other irrespective of their different political persuasions. And I have some comments to make about the role of the Kenyans in diaspora, which I'll probably come to later on. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Callistus, thank you. And let me just reiterate to all of our panelists the brevity and the clarity of their remarks was outstanding. I'm going to open this session up with a couple of questions, and then I will open the floor to questions from the audience. In taking questions from the audience, I would like to have them as succinct as possible. We're not looking for long editorial comment from the audience, but we would like questions that allow the panelists to go into some greater depth. So keep your questions short and clear. The first question that I have, I'm going to address to Maina Kaia in Nairobi, and also to Joel Barkin here in the audience with us, is what do you think the way forward is, and what is the peaceful, nonviolent resolution that Maina spoke of, and how can it take into account the need of the restructuring that Stephen Ndegwa spoke of? Maina, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes, I am. And I got the question, and at some point I lost Stephen. So Stephen, I missed some of your conversation. For us, I think the way forward is to have peace through truth and justice. So what we have been advocating for is that we need to have an internationally supervised or implemented audit, forensic audit, to let us know either how bad the process was at the end, or whether it can be reclaimed, and so then we can try and do a retallying. If we can't do retallying, we try recounting. If not, we go to a rerun. Now we think it's critical. It's really critical for both the sides to meet. I think that if they don't meet, the tensions that we have here and that are going on, and which will continue to grow, I think, no matter what happens, it will flare up at different times. We have also been concerned that the avenues for peaceful, nonviolent expression have been closed down or limited. For a while now, live broadcasting has been banned by the state, even though there's no legal authority to do that. And secondly, there's been no space for any of us to legitimately protest, celebrate, cry, moan. And after going through a period like this, I think it's only natural that people need that space. And I think the closing down of those spaces that are very, very critical and very, very natural for human beings then leads to the exploitation of the illegal spaces and the illegal acts. So in a sense, for us, we would like to see the space so that we can begin talking and dialoguing and thinking and presenting cases forward. We have argued that if the church wants to have a rally at Uhuru Park, or ODM wants to have a rally at Uhuru Park, charge them with the responsibility of maintaining peace and order. If they can't achieve it, then they're the ones who will lose credibility. But I think that this argument isn't getting any listening to, and even though it's also been pushed by the churches, by the peace group that's led by Bethel Kiplagat and others, and I think it just seems like a natural, reasonable thing. But it just seems until the hardliners go down, until the hardliners retreat, until the hardliners give space, we're going to be in for a really, really rough time. And I think that's so I can see a way forward. I think in the sense of the longer term, clearly, I mean, we've reached, as I think all of us say, a constitutional moment. And I think at some point when we were debating these things in the 90s, some people said to us that perhaps it's too early, that we need a crisis before we make a new constitution. I think that all the ingredients are there now for us to have a constitutional moment. Clearly, we need an enabling environment, as Stephen says, before we can move to that longer-term constitutional rearrangement and restructuring, or the Second Republic, as Dr. Juma says. But I think that we've got to be careful in the short term. I think one of the things that we are concerned about here is that we do not get short-term solutions that can inhibit the longer-term solutions, short-term fixes that can affect the longer-term solutions. So I think it's all out there. But I think there's no way this country can move forward unless we are dialoguing, unless we are talking, unless we're putting issues on the table. And I think it's clear to us all, for sure, that no matter what happens, whether it's a rerun or it's something else, or even the by-elections or the new elections to be held for the parliamentary seats that didn't have any results, I think the Electoral Commission of Kenya, as constituted, does not have the confidence of Kenyans and will not be able to conduct any elections that will have our confidence that are free and fair. So as a first step, clearly, we'll have to restructure, disband in effect the Electoral Commission and come up with ways of dealing with it. So as I said earlier, I think you could find, if you look back with hindsight, you can see traces that suggest that maybe there was a plan around these things from way back, and part of it is around the Electoral Commission, and the fact that, and as Stephen says, the IPG deal of 1997, one of its key ingredients, as he says, was the gentleman's agreement that all sides shall nominate candidates for commission in the ECK. It was not legal, it was not put in law, but it was not illegal. And Daniel Moore, in fact, in 97, consulted the opposition then, and they formed an ECK that had our confidence. Unfortunately, this year especially, the President Kibaki decided that he will discard that agreement and make an ECK of his own, and I think this is one of the consequences of that intransigence and of that, I think, an unfortunate decision to trump the IPPG agreement. So I think at this point we've come to a point where any pacts, any agreements in the short term will have to be entrenched in law, because the level of trust is so low on all sides that unless it's entrenched in law and cannot be changed, even a short-term power-sharing agreements or whatever else is there can only be valid and only be useful if they're in law, because the level of trust is so broken at this point.
Maina, thank you. I'm going to ask, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm going to ask Joel to answer the same question.
Well, first the good news and then the bad news. The good news, I think you've just heard it from the three other panelists on the program. There is no shortage of ideas or talent among Kenyans, and particularly Kenyan civil society of their generation. And one thing that has not been mentioned today is the generational divide. And one of the problems, I think, of the current situation, and indeed of the current government, is that they haven't given way, not to small boys, as the phrase is, that is, those still in school in their 20s, but a very talented generation of Kenyans in their late 30s through their middle 50s, who are professionals, who lead civil society, and who have come to the fore and actually kept the lid on this thing the last 2 weeks from spinning out of control. That's the good news. Another aspect of the good news are the efforts at mediation coming forward from distinguished Africans from outside of the country. Now, the bad news is exactly what Maina suggested, and I think Stephen may have mentioned as well. The hardliners, the refusals to sit down on both sides, to put it crudely, a game of chicken being played by both sides. President Kibaki, on the one hand, essentially making the calculation that he can appoint a government, come in on a flawed result, though a result, let's remember, flawed or not, whether he won or not is in a way beside the point. He does have at least 40% of the votes behind him, and that's not an insignificant minority if it's not a majority. So you come in, business as usual, and you basically bet on the fact that by essentially taking the steps that he has, particularly the appointment of Kalonzo Musyoka as the vice president and the cabinet, that essentially Raila Odinga and the ODM will run out of cards to play, and they'll either join as junior partners, which will solve nothing, as we've already discussed. The issue is not really more posts and spoils. That will not solve the problem. Indeed, it has to be a restructuring of the state. And on the other side, let me say one more thing about the decision by Kibaki and his advisors. I think there's a cynical element here as well, and that is, if you need to sacrifice the Kikuyu internal diaspora out in the Rift Valley, then perhaps so be it. And that's very tragic. Now, on the other side, Raila Odinga is basically, I think he's missed some opportunities. I already mentioned in my opening about not following, immediately accepting the audit and calling for a new election, which I think was crazy because he would lose in a runoff. But essentially, sitting it out, waiting for the cost to mount, both in terms of what's occurring in Western Uganda, on the one hand, and the mounting cost to the business class. We really haven't talked about economics today. In the first week alone, Kenya lost an estimated $500 million to their economy. That's more than Kenya obtains in aid every year. It's now going to approach $1 billion in the second week. And what Raila is banking on here is that the business class will eventually put pressure on the government, as well they should, because that business class is disproportionately Kikuyu. So both sides are basically, as I suggested, playing a game for chicken at the expense of the rest of the country, and this is being led by their respective hardliners. What then do you do about the respective hardliners? Well, I think we need to target them, and here's where the diplomatic community can come in, the international community. There are such things as travel bans. We knew who the hardliners are, and we can squeeze them. That may not work, but it's probably the only tool the international community has. The aid lever is not there. This is not Kenya of 1992. So targeting has to be very selective. And short of that, I think the bad news is we have to wait for a situation of rightness to emerge, and then perhaps there can be the hard bargaining of restructuring the state exactly on the lines that Maina and Stephen have alluded to, and which I've written about myself. One final comment in that regard. The issue of group rights needs to be addressed as much as individual rights. Too often, I think those of us coming from a Western perspective look at this in terms of opening up space at an individual level, which has occurred in Kenya, freedom of speech, assembly, the like. But there is a group rights issue here. The analogy would be India, that was partly solved by the States Reorganization Act of 1956, where there was severe linguistic conflict in that country, Nigeria, etc. I think, in other words, some form of federalism ultimately will be part of any permanent deal. But in the meantime, an IPPG incremental type solution, such as Stephen and Maina have referred to, is probably the best we can hope for. Thank you.
Great responses. Let's take some questions from the audiences. Brief, identify yourself before you give your question. We have John Harbison first, and then the lady in the black suit just behind. Yes, sir.
John Harbison, City University of New York. I want to push Steve a bit on the pact-making idea. My recollection is that the reason why IPPG worked was because there was significant fragmentation within Moi's group. That was what drove it. So what do you think is going to bring the hardliners to the table? And do you think the international community is going to do that? Is it going to be the business community, or is it going to happen alone?
Ambassador Johnson, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rosemary Segero. I'm the Vice President of Amani Club Ambassadors. We focus on crime. We advocate for fighting crime and violence. I come from Kenya. My nephew was among the people who were first shot. He was one of the officials of the election, and he was shot in this matter. The only person I agree with is Maina and Dr. Juma. What I'm saying, Maina, is I'm a Kenyan. I'm speaking as the Vice President of Amani, as a Kenyan woman, a parent, a mother who lost his son in Kenya also. What the Kenyan leaders should do is let them involve faith-based organizations, youth, women, to talk about this. As much as you call people from London, from where coming to talk this resolution, we have to reconcile, come back and build Kenya. We want Kenya to be the same. Kenya can never change. Kenya will remain the same. We are Kenyans, overseas and here. Please, let's get together. I'm coming there. Let me meet you. I'm meeting President Kibaki, Okinga, and let's dialogue and come to a solution. Nobody's going to come from out to solve a problem in Kenya. Thank you.
I'm going to ask again that we restrict ourselves to questions and not commentary. I don't want to be impolite in cutting people off. But forewarned, I will interrupt if there are commentary. We're looking for questions for our panelists. We'll take these two questions and then, well, let me go with a third one. Ambassador Lyman has a question.
Princeton Lyman, Council on Foreign Relations. This is for Mr. Ndegwa. You mentioned the strengthening of Parliament, and I wondered if ODM's substantial lead in Parliament would lead ODM to take up that issue now as part of a solution to strengthen the role of Parliament.
Why don't we just take these three questions?
Okay. Thank you. John, my sense of an IPPG type settlement and the possibility for it, I think it's actually, the moment is ripe. They've kind of reverted to these.
Closer. You can hear louder.
Okay, sorry. I think the crisis itself will push them to that. The issue is how do you expand the subject of the pact, or the subjects of the pact, because the intent, I think, the initial instinct will be to simply resolve the electoral question and representation on our government. But how do you push them to include the broader issues of regional imbalances and inequality and also class issues? And I think that's where the role of other parties beyond the two principal players would come in, including business. But business is not terribly well organized and does tend to kowtow to the ethnic calculus of the different parties. The faith-based group would be helpful, and perhaps other organizations that are in civil society. If you go back to 1991, 92, and 93, there were organizations such as the National Constitutional Executive Committee. That Maina might have been on it as well, but Willie Mutunga and others who spoke to these more fundamental issues, and they had subcommittees on different areas, not just on a constitutional as text, but also sort of larger state issues, state structure issues. So you could have that momentum. So the issue would be get them at the table, but then expand this. But I think, as Callisto's also said, these things do need to be legislated. Because otherwise they become sort of at the pleasure of the president in a sense. I do agree with Rosemary that in fact you do need greater participation of faith-based organizations, but also non-faith-based organizations in trying to resolve the conflict. And I agree entirely with Maina that the clamping down of the civic space, especially through the inability of live media to operate. It might have made sense in the first few hours because, as we saw in Rwanda, the genocide was propelled by live media. But beyond the first day or so, I think it becomes quite irresponsible to shut out that space, both in terms of the mourning aspect, but also in terms of the kind of building bridges one could do within community settings, and I think that's quite important. Ambassador Lyman, on the question of strengthening Parliament, I think ODM has an incredible opportunity to truly transform Parliament. First of all, given their numbers, they can pick the Speaker at their leisure. They can also very well pick the Deputy Speaker. And if they pick speakers who are able to structure debate and permit a more expansive role of Parliament, and I think Joel and I, would agree. Somebody like Oloa Ringo, who's been tremendously important in expanding the role of Parliament under Moi and under Kibaki, that kind of person would have a tremendous impact on the institution itself and open up opportunities. What ODM cannot do, which I know will not work, is do what the Malawi Parliament has done, which is try to impeach the president every opportunity they get. And hold up the budget, partly because they don't have the numbers, and they've held up the budget, but then as a consequence they were sent home as soon as they sent the budget. So you cannot have sort of that continuous change. But I think that if you look at the profile of the MPs elected, it's younger, more educated, and is it 60% new, Joel? Is that? They really do want to work. So I do believe that if Parliament convenes and if the President, and again this is another institutional issue, allows Parliament to sit as soon as possible and continue, you will have a momentum that actually diminishes this presidential contest and produces the kind of policy that you need. There are a couple of legislative actions that need to take place. There's been the last 14 months a discussion around a new organic budget law that would streamline the budget process, but also give Parliament a greater input in the budget. There's also been the establishment of a fiscal affairs office, which is sort of equivalent of the Congressional Budget Office, that has grudgingly been allowed by the Kibaki administration to exist. But the parliamentarians are very intent on having their own analytical base to speak around budget issues and act on it. So things like that could move forward. But sort of being obstructionist as a way of containing the administration is not going to solve anybody, right? And I think the whole idea of the Constituency Development Fund, which is a tremendous asset for decentralizing resources to all regions, and actually is one of the things that we think, including the bank, has worked quite well in terms of transmitting resources at the local level. I mean, they will want to be there. If the parliament does not meet and deliberate on those, that money doesn't move. And I'm sure the government could find other ways to use that money. So it's imperative, I think, for ODM to participate creatively within this. Now, I'm sure a lot of people who would disagree that this sort of moving on idea that I am presenting is probably not the right way. But I really, just to be realistic, don't see any other way that does not call upon a greater deal of violence to force a compromise. And I do agree with Joel that a rerun ODM would lose.
We're going to take three more questions quickly in the audience. Percy, we've got one here. Percy Wilson. No, back here. And we'll come. I'm sorry. Right here. Okay. And then just the young lady just down the row after you, Percy.
Thank you very much. This question is it's a general question to anyone in the audience, particularly on the issue of the economy. I suspect that unless the situation changes immediately or soon, there will be a move on the part of the business community to look to South Africa as a new operating center. Is there a particular role for the international business community in finding a solution to the immediate crisis, in particular the Asian business community, which is very much a part of the day-to-day life of Kenya?
Could you pass it to your left? Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Erin Heba, and I'm representing the U.S. Peace Corps. I just returned as a volunteer from Kenya. And my question is, what can be done to, it piggybacks off of yours a little bit, what can be done to for Kenya to gain the trust of its citizens and to also heal the wounds? And I'm asking, like, in what ways can the international community help not only the federal government and the parliament and the presidency, but also the local people that are mourning and trying to figure out how to move forward? Thank you.
We've got an overflow audience. Let me just add a couple of more quick questions to the two that are out there on the floor right now. These come from the overflow room. What are the inducements for Raila Odinga to consider participation in the government, given the fact that the vice president's job has already been given away and that there's no prime minister job? And another question, how does the Kenya experience relate to the maturation of democracy across Africa, given the events in other recent elections, Ethiopia and Nigeria being cited? These are from the overflow. On the economic question that was raised first, I'm going to let, if I could, Callistus, could you take the first questions on the economic issues, and then I'm going to ask Mina, who's still with us, to take a crack, and then we'll go back to Joel and Stephen. But first, the economic issues raised, Callistus.
Yeah, I think the economics question is probably the one that's going to force even the Kenyan leaders to start talking to each other, not just because of the international business investment opportunities, but also the implications in the region. Most of the discussions taking place in the neighboring countries have to do with the economic impact of events in Kenya. So Kenya plays more or less the same role as Mexico plays vis-a-vis the Central American countries. There is the other part of this that I've been very interested in, and I haven't done much work on it yet, which is the China part, because China plays very important role in the region, but also considering that most of the major new contracts signed by Kenya in the infrastructure arena have been with China. And this is where probably some diplomatic work could be done to engage China in terms of the long-term implications of the investment in the region as a whole. If I could just comment on the last question that came from the overflow, this has to do with the nature of democracy, particularly multi-party politics in Africa. I've made it publicly known that particularly this country and other Western democracies haven't served Africa well by pushing for multi-party politics, but not providing sufficient support for the emergence of party institutions. There are no party platforms, so you have these alliances which are called parties, but if you look carefully, they are not really parties. They are, most of them are ethnic alliances masquerading as political parties. And I haven't seen any significant development of party platform and party institutions in African democracy. And until we start to have parties being seen as parties and not as a cover for political interest, I don't think we're going to have much trust in multi-party politics itself and even in democratic change. So my appeal to the US is really to start thinking about how to support African countries generally to create genuine political parties, not simply facades of political movements, which is what we see across Africa.
Okay, Callistus. Maina, any comments on any of the four questions on the floor?
Yes, absolutely. But first, let me just put a word of caution as somebody who's here and who travels quite a bit around the country. Stephen, I don't think this will be business as usual as before. I don't think that people will let go of this and just move on as much as you're advocating. I think you've got to understand that the level of resentment and the level of loss about the peaceful tool that we have had to make our expressions known, to make our choices known, and what pain that has caused will not end that easily. I doubt it will have business as usual. And as somebody who participated in the 90s on a very consistent basis in mass action, I think that, and John Harbison, the question you asked about IPPG, you remember that it was a reaction to some extent to the mass action that we in civil society were putting out at that point, and that Moi then felt the pressure so big that he appealed to politicians to meet up. I think there is, I'm not predicting anything because I know it, but my sense is that given the level of resentment, given the level of schisms, I think you will probably see a lot more disruptions, a lot more mass action, a lot more events like this that will have an impact on the economy. I also wanted to add a little bit about the visas, and I think that, absolutely, Joel, we have to get a position where there is revocation of visas for the hardliners on both sides, but also for the bureaucratic core around here, on both the PNU and the ODM, and not just for them themselves, but also for the immediate families. I know a lot of these people who are hardliner have got kids out in the States, out in the UK, out in Europe, out in South Africa, and I think if there can be a consensus push of revoking these visas and these student things as well for immediate families to force these people to be here with us, to feel the pinch as we are doing, I think you will start seeing progress on these issues. And I've made this pitch on radio and been received exceedingly well, both at the middle class level and the ordinary person level in this country. I also think that yes, aid to Kenya is what, 4% of the budget or less, but the development budget is a bit more, I think. And I know that quite a lot of the free education budget is financed by donor support. I think we've got to come to terms, and again, what Joel said about the economic loss so far will continue. I think the Kenya government's revenue collection will be way less this year than it was last year, and I think that maybe aid freeze would have an impact in forcing people to the table, and I think that's when you start seeing movement on. On the Prime Minister job, there's nothing in the Kenyan Constitution that bars the President from creating the position of Prime Minister. the Section 26 of the Constitution allows the President the power to create any position, any public office as he wishes. Now, the difficulty is that even if he did create a Prime Minister's position for Raila Odinga or even for Oloa Oringo, for anybody else, for that matter, for Nazlin Omar, well, even if he did that, I don't think that, and I don't think it would be acceptable unless that position is backed up in law. So I think there is, and I think you've got to understand that following the disruption or the non-recognition of the Memorandum of Understanding between Kibaki and Raila in 2002, which was ignored, and then following the other events from 2002 to 2007, and then the ECK, the Electoral Commission agreements, following all these, the level of mistrust is so high that unless any agreement is backed by law, I don't think you see any movement. The key question for all of us is, what do we do for the ordinary people? How do we preserve space? How do we preserve life? How do we preserve food and shelter for the ordinary people in this country who has always, in a fight like this, in a struggle like this, bear the brunt? And I think there's somebody there who said that maybe some calculation was made that we can afford to lose a number of lives so that we can carry on our agenda. I think that is really the cynical and correct view of the political class that we have in this country. I think the challenge for all of us in this country is figuring out how to move. I am not so convinced at this point that the faith-based groups at this point can provide a solution. The divisions within the faith-based groups are probably even deeper than those that exist between the political groups. They are absolutely deep. You can hardly get people from different regions to come and agree. They're so deep, it's unbelievable. So I'm not sure that's where the answer is. And the reason why we, in a sense, who are trying to present ourselves as a third way, keep calling for international support, is that we appreciate that the level of mistrust, the schisms, the cleavages in this country are so deep that it will take somebody who doesn't have the perceptions that are there to start bringing us together, and then we can take off on it without them. But at this point, I think that it's almost impossible to find a person who both sides will accept. Bethel Kiblagat comes out and says, I want to do peace. The first thing Raila Odinga says is, I know this man, I know what he did, I can't have him. There's hardly anybody today that can come up and be accepted by both sides. So maybe the path for us maybe is to move then away from independence to bipartisan. Maybe that way we can move an agenda forward. I think and then just a little thing, Professor Juma, on the working on the parties. I completely agree with you about the strengthening of parties. But I'm sure you're aware that over the last, literally the last 5-10 years, there's been a lot of money, a lot of effort being pumped into helping the parties move away from ethnic cleavage, ethnic constituencies to some form of ideological work, to move away from the idea that an individual who funds a party and owns the party, and it from being simply a vehicle to go to parliament and to power. I'm not sure the results have been that great, but maybe it's too early in the game to call that, and maybe we need to give it another 5-10 years of really consistent work. What gives me hope today is that as this crisis emerges, there is a beginning of younger people, well-educated people coming up. And this Kenya of 2007 or 2008 is very different from the Kenya of the 90s. People are much more empowered. People are much more willing to resist. When there were these attempts early before the election itself to send administration police to go and clearly do some work in Nyanza in private buses who were saying they were going to provide security. No one had any uniform among those police officers. They were being stopped by Kenyans. Kenyans said, you get out of this, you go back. I mean, there's a level of empowerment that's here in this country that hasn't been there. And I think it will be very hard for us, this country, to go back to where we were in November, October last year, thinking that it will happen this way. So I think a more cautious approach, a more broader approach in this is really where it's going to go. I think you must also not underrate the strength and the power of the hardliners in the Kibaki government, especially. And I don't know how many of you saw the BBC Hard Talk yesterday, which you read and you almost don't believe that we're living in the same country, in the same situation. I mean, the whole idea is that government essentially is refusing to recognize that there's a crisis. So I just want to leave that there.
Ina, thank you very much. I'm going to let Joel make a few comments before taking several more questions. Joel?
Yeah, I want to say something about democratization, but quickly respond to Maina first. I think mass action at this point, although it has worked in the past, is extremely risky and dangerous, though I fully realize that is an implicit tilt towards the status quo. I'm glad you agree with me about, shall we say, targeted sanctions on individual hardliners. But then let's turn to what might be accomplished in the short term on incremental type reforms such as the IPPG of 10 years ago. Well, one problem, as I suggested, is the generational divide. That is to say, if we are coming to the end of the first republic in Kenya and searching for a new one, as Callistus has suggested, which is a nice metaphor and may in fact come about in some grand constitutional reform, the history has been that change takes place incrementally in Kenya even when there's adjustment. At least that's certainly the history of the last 15 years, beginning with the repeal of 2A in the Constitution back in late 1991, which didn't really change anything. It just simply said we're going to have multi-party elections on from tomorrow. But a couple of small things. For example, an age cap. If you can't be a minister if you're above 70, and you might, make some exceptions, but you simply have a neutral rule like that.
Don't make exceptions.
Huh? Don't make exceptions, okay? I won't.
The Vatican has a cup.
That would, that's a nice innocuous thing that you could bargain for. Stephen mentioned the Constituency Development Fund. I think we have to acknowledge that there have been some sort of creeping federalism in terms of the expansion of local funds over the last 5 years. The Constituency Development Fund, which was resisted bitterly by the government, eventually they gave way. It's currently at 2.5%. It could go up to 5%, maybe 10%, although the World Bank and the IMF might get upset about that. Wildly popular. Popular among Kenyans, popular among, that is, rank and file Kenyans, popular among MPs, did something to overcome the feeling that whoever controls the presidency controls all, whether it's for the benefit of Central Province or in the previous regime where everything was funneled into a secondary school up in Kabarak. I'm overstating on purpose. In other words, it doesn't have to be, quote, Majimbo, which is a highly emotive word of federalism. If we would look for perhaps near-term incremental solutions in a pact format, but I would certainly agree with what Maina says. They have to be put into law. There was a good one in respect to the composition of the Electoral Commission, and then look what happens this time around. 17 new commissioners appointed unilaterally by Kibaki just before the election. So incremental reforms, consolidation, hastening generational change, I think all this is to the good, because one thing that is distinctive about this younger generation that I mentioned, and I think it's very critical for democratization on the continent as a whole, but in Kenya particularly, these people simply think differently than their elders. It's not a matter of education. George Saitote has a PhD financed by the Rockefeller Foundation from Brandeis University. The type of politics he practices is what Stephen suggested. It's old neo-patrimonial politics. It doesn't solve the problems. People like Maina, David Ndii, etc., there's a whole generation here, and among the MPs too. One sign is if you go into the offices of an MP and if you see the computer on his desk with a plastic cover, as opposed to the guy who's, on the internet, SMSing to Stephen, etc. These people are plugged into global norms. They're very sensitive in moving Kenya into the global economy. They're responsible for the pushing the fiber optic cable that is now being laid between Mombasa and Doha, which if that comes to effect, then others like them, including Mary Miru here in the room, who invests in ICT and call centers and this kind of thing, can spring forward. That's the new Kenya. And part of the incremental change has to give more space to these people to operate.
We're going to take several more questions from the audience. We have a young man in the black coat here, second row, and then we'll go down to the left and then to the woman in the back.
Thank you. My name is Duncan Kiara. I'm a Kenyan national living and working in D.C. I have a two-part question, I think, for Dr. Ndegwa and Professor Juma. Going beyond the incremental changes we've discussed, Dr. Ndegwa, you alluded to the lack of impetus to change the constitutional order and, by extension, the state structures. Where, in your view, do you think that impetus would come from? Because clearly, the participants don't have that impetus because of the spoils of the presidential office. And by extension, Professor Juma, where do you think the Kenyan diaspora has a role to play? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks. Go there, and then...
Hi, thank you. My name is Kevin Kelly. I'm the U.S. correspondent of The Nation. This is for Professor Barkin primarily, but for everybody as well. The implication I took from what you said is that Raila Odinga won the election and was cheated out of it. Will IRI say that? Is that a conclusion that the monitoring group comes to? And if so, doesn't that need to be the starting point for anything that happens in the future as far as redressing the grievances of the people who feel they've been treated badly in all this?
Behind you, and to your left. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mina Kane, and I'm also a Kenyan working in Washington, D.C. And I want to address my question to Maina Kiai in Kenya. And first, to actually thank Maina for being a voice of sanity, I think a voice of sanity and balance in this really traumatic time. And we obviously in the diaspora, and he's gone, we obviously in the diaspora, one thing that we're united in is feeling the distress and the concern about what is happening in Kenya, despite our differences in figuring out who did what and whose fault it is or isn't. And my question really is, what can we in the Kenyan diaspora, maybe repeating a little bit what Duncan has said, if we want to send humanitarian immediate help to Kenya, what is the most effective way to do it? We might send money to the Kenyan Red Cross, but I wondered whether Maina might have the specific suggestions for what we can do right now in order to help our country.
I'm going to add a fourth question, in part drawn from something that's come in from the other room. This is directed mainly at Maina. The others can take it on as well. Will a prolonged conflict or the lack of resolution in the current conflict result in an evolution towards a Ivorian type of situation in Kenya? Can we take those four questions? Stephen, you want to start with those? Okay. Have we lost Maina? We can't. Okay. Okay.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. Maina, did you hear my last question?
No, I didn't. I was not. I couldn't hear a thing. I hope you didn't see me making faces at you all.
No, that's if you did, that's perfectly all right. Maina, the last question I asked. Yeah, I'll ask the fourth question that's drawn in part from one of the questions coming in from the overflow room here, and that is the lack of a political resolution to the problem in Kenya. Might it lead to an Ivorian type of political situation in Kenya if there is no political resolution in the short time?
I suppose one has to be very careful with a question like that, simply because perhaps our desires and our wishes may cloud our analysis, because I don't think any of us would like to see an Ivorian situation. But I think in reality, in realistic terms, I think one of the options, one of the worst case scenario options one must see is a Zimbabwe, either a Zimbabwe type option where the government is extremely hard on people, very tough, in an emergency type of operation with a concomitant shrinking of the economy, or the other part is some people saying we are fed up with this arrangement. We don't feel that we are valued enough. We don't feel that our contribution over the years since pre-independence, post-independence, from the 60s up to now has been recognized, and that there's a consistent marginalization of certain communities. Then, who knows? I think those would be the worst case options. I think it's incumbent upon all of us not to allow that to happen. I think, as you said, Ambassador, Kenya is such an important country within that sub-region that I think that the world really, we ourselves as Kenyans, but also the world really should come in and step in and not allow this to happen. I mean, I think a lot of us, when we have discussions, keep saying, I wish George Bush would send his Marines, instead of fighting in Iraq, would send his Marines in and pick out these hardliners and go off with them to Mogadishu or something like that, so we can continue with our country. So, I mean, it's really very difficult. But I hope we don't get there. And I think and that's why I agree with Joel here, that maybe targeted sanctions at the individuals and their families and their properties abroad, because many of these people also have assets abroad. Targeting them so they feel the economic and personal pinch may actually be a solution. But at some points, perhaps when President Barack Obama takes over in the United States, we'll ask him to come and save us and take off these hardliners out of Kenya.
We won't let American politics interfere with any of this this morning. Thanks, Maina. I'm going to let Stephen Ndegwa handle some of the questions that are on the floor, and then we're going to quickly run down through the other panelists. Stephen.
Maina, it's nice to know we're all being very Kenyan, keeping a sense of humor in spite of the tragedy. So I think very, very quickly, just on the question of where the impetus for constitutional reform would come, or sort of this thoroughgoing reform of the state. One, I think we should not dismiss the idea that it's always been there. An undercurrent of most of the resistance to the authoritarian state in Kenya since the 60s has been about reformulating state and what the state provides to its citizens. The Mboya political trajectory, the JM trajectory, the 1980s so-called Mwakenya underground movement. So there's always been this sense that the state we got at independence is not delivering the promise that we all expected. So in a sense, what a crisis like this does is really truly surface those in ways that are difficult to suppress. And what you would want is for there to be sufficient numbers of politicians who are able to articulate a new vision. I think among the principal contenders right now, we don't have that. Perhaps among the second-tier folks and the third sector, as Maina puts it, you might find that articulation, and I don't think it'll be difficult. I think it's the outlines are there, the claims are there. It's a matter of putting those in the political arena and acting on those in a constitutional manner. In terms of the Ambassador Carson, if you'd allow me to highlight Mine's question to Maina, because I think you might have been blacked out when we were talking about this, or maybe just let her restate it.
Yes, go ahead. No, you do it.
Okay, Maina, there was a question here about Kenyans in the diaspora and how we could participate in helping heal the wounds, especially at the local level, providing some sort of financial support, and whether the Red Cross, the Kenyan Red Cross, is the best way to do it, or if there are other options that you see. I would add to that, if there's also other platforms for intellectual engagement with groups like yours, but also the politicians, to try to push these ideas for resolving the crisis and looking the way forward would be. So financially and intellectually, how can Kenyans abroad who typically feel quite disempowered, how can they participate? Thanks.
If I may just come onto that, Stephen, with your permission, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, absolutely.
I think the first thing the diaspora must do is stop circulating those emails that are really making things worse. I get some of those emails. I have never seen such painful language that's going on, propaganda being shifted on both sides that really people in the diaspora should not be party to. That's the first thing you guys must do as diaspora. They are coming now to the other part of the question. There are basically three levels of interventions that are going on from the broad independent sector. There's the humanitarian relief effort that is being coordinated by the National Council of Churches of Kenya with the Red Cross and Catholic Relief Services, also being involved in Oxfam and ActionAid and other groups of that nature. So if you can find a way, if you want to make a donation for humanitarian assistance, that's one way which you all can contribute. The second level of intervention is the peace groups. These are being led by Deka Ibrahim and with involvement of General Sumbeyo and Bebeto Kiplagat, which has been looking at shuttling back and forth, bringing all these retired ex-presidents in and trying to put a message of peace. We have been in discussions with them, and I think now before they've been just talking about calm, and now they're moving into peace, truth, and justice, which I think is a better way forward as we go along. And when you talk about peace, truth, and justice, we're saying justice not just for the election issue, but also the aftermath of the election and the violence and the killings that have gone on. And then the third level is now this independent sector that includes some business community people, that includes the independent state organizations like the National Commission on Human Rights, which I chair, that includes civil society. And within that is also a broadening view where we are trying to also chart out a way forward outside the immediate, also which involves constitutional reform, and also coming up with scenarios that we can come in there. So Stephen is a place where intellectually you can engage with us to help us chart this as we go. So it's out there. These groups that are led by with Kenya Leadership Institution, David Ndii, the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the ICJ, International Commission of Jurists, the Law Society of Kenya, the National Commission on Human Rights, and there's a lot of and then also the KAM, the IEA, a lot of these groups are there. KEPSA has now joined in as well, the Kenya Private Enterprise. The Kenya Private Sector Alliance has joined into it. So it's growing and growing and growing as we move. So it's something that is coming up. And I think that at some point we are looking at this sooner rather than later. There's an intention to bring us all together in one room, because all these initiatives are running in a very disparate manner, and I hope you'll appreciate that the first week after that shock of looking at elections being messed up in front of your very eyes and issues being raised and nobody is dealing with them, I think there was that. After that shock, we were just meeting in a very disparate, disorganized manner. I think now we're beginning to collate and come together, and we're hoping at some point if the Commissioner of Police, and I'm glad that the ambassador is there, if he can inform the government to let us have a forum where we can at least think and brainstorm for a peaceful way forward, that would be great. And I think that will be able to help this country move forward all in all.
We're running close to time. I'm going to ask, if I could, for any final comments from all of our panelists. I know there were a couple of the last round of questions about democracy that and the implications for it that weren't answered. Let me go through and ask Joel for any final comments, and then go through all of our panelists.
Well, first of all, to begin with the obvious, the implication for democracy both for Kenya and across the continent is that this election, had it turned out differently, would have been really the crowning achievement of a nearly 2-decade-long struggle. And I think we need to keep some perspective here and remember that democracy is not built overnight. It wasn't in this country, and it certainly isn't going to be built overnight in plural societies, agrarian societies such as Kenya and most other African countries. It's a process of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that actually gives me some hope that perhaps 10 years from now, if we can get out of the initial predicament with some mini reforms and then ultimately leading to a perhaps a new constitutional dispensation, that we might look back on this situation as Kenya's really time of trial and fire, but which in the end was healthy for the overall process. A couple of other final points here. Yes, what I said about the election, I think you see my tilt on it, but in a way it's beside the point. If you're going to build a stable democracy, it's not only majority rule, it's the balance between majority rule and minority rights. And so, yes, you can't have a series of flawed elections and build a democracy, but in terms of what do you do now, I think you have to come back to that issue on how you achieve that abstract balance given the sociological and structural composition of Kenyan society, and we've already covered some of those points. Finally, to end on an optimistic note, Stephen's reference to humor. We shouldn't forget here that the members of the Kenyan political elite on both sides know each other. They know each other by their first names. You walk into Parliament, they're drinking beer together in the afternoon. These are people who can and have cut deals in the past. We need to play on that fact. And finally, in terms of an articulation of where to go next, by the very nature of the fact that President Kibaki has had himself sworn in to power and is controlling the government at this time, he represents the status quo. If there's going to be an articulation of where to move next, I agree with Stephen, it has to come from ODM. I would hope that their intellectuals, their fellow political scientists like Peter and Nyang'ongo, come forward and practice their analytic craft as well as their political craft and articulate that vision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Callistus?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the discussions we've had here and many others have focused way too much on the character of the leaders and too little on the popular sentiments in the country, that we have really a new mood in Kenya, not just in Kenya, but Africa as a whole. And I think that the only way that we can effectively satisfy that mood is to work on getting those who are in office now to recognize that their legacy is going to depend largely on how effectively they transfer power to the next generations. And this is, I think, a lot of this is going to be a process of outreach in terms of being able to reach out to those in office and convince and persuade them that they have a much larger responsibility, which is to really transfer power. And this is why I wanted to connect this a bit to the diaspora question, because the diaspora here have enormous influence. As you know, last year they were the largest source of foreign exchange and earnings for the country, more than tourism. And I know for a fact that Kenyan politicians of all persuasions do listen to the diaspora, and I would like to encourage the diaspora to think about having a collective voice. Maina is absolutely right. The worst form of vitriol I have seen poured around has actually come from diaspora, totally insensitive and to a large extent irresponsible. But I think if there can be a certain degree of thinking around the diaspora, and I think the entry point is the humanitarian angle, that there are some urgent things that need to be done. And if the humanitarian interventions for the diaspora can become a basis for cultivating a platform that could allow the Kenyans out to reach out to all politicians and all leaders to encourage this smooth transfer of power, which makes it possible to achieve what I consider the shift to the Second Republic of Kenya, which is really where we are. That's really my thinking at the moment. That's what I work on most of the time. And I haven't had any difficulties reaching out to any of these leaders on all sides because they do value, in fact, external input. Whether it leads to any shift locally, I don't know. Maina, I had actually the same view about George Bush, the proposal on George Bush, and I was persuaded last night by a colleague not to mention it publicly.
Very, very briefly, I was
Let's just thank you very, very much, Stephen.
I was going to say, I entirely agree with everything my two senior and more wiser colleagues have said, except that last one. But
I was persuaded not to say it.
Okay. Well, I will persuade you again. No, really, just seriously, to simply associate myself with those comments, and also just say that I remain hopeful. I have a sense of democracy building as a historical process that's not always linear. And that will have bumps and difficulties, and some of them quite violent. I don't quite recall any democracy in the world that has been built without some essential violence. And so we should be disappointed, but we should not be shocked about this. But I do see that Kenyans are able to take a moment like this and really marshal out of it a creative solution that will help them govern themselves better in the coming generation. So I'm hopeful for that. My last comment, I guess, would be to repeat the caveat that...
I'll repeat it for you. He's speaking on his own behalf and not that of the World Bank. Mina, it is only appropriate.
The bank is lucky to have him.
Absolutely. Mina, it is only appropriate that of all the panelists, you should be entitled to the last word. You are probably at about 8 o'clock there, going on 9. You're 8,000 miles away, and you're 7 time zones away. And we appreciate your willingness to sacrifice your own time to participate. So I'll give you the final word from the panel.
Thank you very much. And I will make it very brief because it is really late, and although I have a few more meetings to go to this. The first thing is that I would encourage all of you there to ask the U.S. government and the U.S. Embassy to authorize the release of that IRI exit poll. I think it would be good if they could do it. We understand that it's been kept there. It's been blocked.
Natalie, any chance? While we are waiting to see if we can, in fact, give Mina Kia the last word, and it may, in fact, be the last word, let me, on behalf of the Wilson Center, in particular Ambassador Howard Wolpe, who could not be with us, on behalf of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Steve Morrison and his organization at CSIS, who are co-partnering this, we are extraordinarily pleased to have been able to bring 4 outstanding panelists together this morning to talk about Kenya. And we're extraordinarily appreciative to Mina Kia, who has joined us from a long way, for Joel Barkin, for Stephen Ndegwa, and for Callistus Juma. And I'd like you all to give them a round of applause, please. And finally, I would like to make just one administrative announcement. CSIS and the Wilson Center will be holding a follow-up discussion, panel discussion on Kenya and the evolution of events on Wednesday, January 16th. There will be a more formal announcement coming out to all of you from CSIS, from Steve Morrison and Jennifer Cook, who's here, on this event, and the panelists who will be participating. But it is slated for January 16th. Mark your calendars. And it will, in fact, trace the evolution of the continuing negotiations that are occurring in Kenya. Let me close by making, again, one editorial comment that I made before when I started this program. Kenya is an extraordinarily important country in Africa, and it probably remains the most important country politically, economically, financially in East Africa and the Greater Horn. I think all of us in this room have been shattered, touched, moved, and probably saddened and hurt by the aftermath of the December 27th elections. We all wish Kenya well, and we hope that its leaders will put their citizens and their country before